So why did Hitler do this to Russia? Why did he engage in Operation Barbarossa? There are really six reasons why. The first is Lebensraum, which is a German word, so I'm probably saying it very badly, but that means living space. Hitler needed land, and as far as he could see, Russia's the biggest land. It is the biggest country in the world, so conquer it, get a whole bunch of land. Russia also owned Ukraine at the time, and Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. It's got great fertile soil, so this would give Hitler great fertile soil. Other raw materials too. Russia has tons of oil, potatoes, oil, oil the most important, clearly. There's obviously ideological concerns. You know, Hitler is a fascist. Stalin is calling himself a communist. These two are at opposite ends of the political spectrum, so ideologically they don't get along. In case you didn't know, Hitler was a racist, and Hitler viewed the Russians as what he called Untermenschen, again my horrible German, which means subhuman. He looked at the Russian Slavic people as, you know, an inferior race. He wanted the whole world to be Aryan. Now keep in mind, Hitler, obviously another one of his hypocrisies, he is much more Slavic looking than Aryan looking. And then also he wanted to strike first. Both men incredibly paranoid, lots of mental issues going on, and he was totally convinced that Stalin was going to attack him at some point, so he figured he might as well get the heads up. Whether or not Stalin would have attacked is hard to tell. What the heck is an Aryan? Because we use this term all the time. These are my little images. An Aryan is in ancient German mythology. It was this supreme race that ruled the world. And remember, Hitler loved mythology, so he was convinced that he could get this race to rule the world again. Characteristics of this race of people: blonde hair, blue eyes, pretty muscular and strong, and, you know, thick boned. And so he would do stuff like encourage breeding between people who met these characteristics and discourage breeding between people who didn't. And obviously part of this racism is what ties into, you know, the Holocaust. Jews are very different than this usually. Czechs, Poles, those types of people, they're not Aryan. So there's a whole lot going on here in terms of his race relationships. All right, that's a lot that's just been thrown at you. And one country that we haven't talked about at all is us. All we said is they gave Britain a little bit of money. So where was America? Well, we get involved in World War II because Japan attacks us. Japan? Wait, we haven't mentioned Japan either. All right, quick history of Japan in 30 seconds. Go. Japan had been ruled by different dynasties, and then it became a feudal samurai state, which was like this elite military class. You've probably pictured the samurai soldiers. And then the dynasties came back. So it's kind of just like a back and forth. When the dynasties were restored in 1850, the Meiji dynasty is going to be the one that comes back into power. And they are going to be determined to exert the strength of Japan in this new changing world. And so they're going to lead Japan through a couple of wars at the turn of the century: the Sino-Japanese War against China and the 1903 Russo-Japanese War against Russia, all in a conquest to gain more land for this tiny island nation. Through these wars, Japan is going to be able to claim territories such as Korea, Taiwan, and Okinawa. So that was considered successful. They take a couple years to rebuild, establish their presence in those colonies that they've just gained, and then between 1931 and 1937, Japan is going to do the same thing. Find some lands that they're going to go after. They're going to go after Manchuria and Indochina. Manchuria and Indochina is the whole area here, basically. Okay, part of China, and then Indochina is down in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. So Japan's goal wanted to basically be take over this whole chunk of land. We were trade partners with both Manchuria and Indochina, and so we didn't like this. It was affecting our trade. So our president at the time, a guy by the name of FDR, tries diplomatically to get Japan to back down. He declares an oil and strategic resource embargo, meaning we will no longer trade with Japan until Japan gets out of Indochina and Manchuria, until they unilaterally withdraw. So it was just it was a trade stop. We're not going to trade with you anymore, Japan, since you're affecting our trade. So you get out of those, we'll restore trade, all will be good. That was the request. Who are the key players behind this movement? Obviously, our president was the guy who's doing most of the work for the U.S. His name, as we know, is President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President of the United States. He was first elected 1932, and then he's going to be elected to a total of 4 terms, though he doesn't complete his last term. He dies in office. Yes, can't a guy only be president 2 terms? Yes, that law was passed after FDR, clearly. At that point, it had just been a tradition based on the precedent set by George Washington. Franklin Delano Roosevelt also suffered from a disease known as polio that had left him paralyzed. He wasn't truly paralyzed. He could have some sensation, but for the most part, he either was in a wheelchair or he stood with a cane or a crutch, or he'd get to places early and stand behind the podium and use that to hold himself up. Most Americans did not know this until after his death, however, because he didn't want to portray a sense of weakness, which in his head it would have. He was married to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his very, very distant cousin. So there's FDR, and then his wife Eleanor, who is one of the most powerful first ladies that the U.S. ever had. For Japan, they're going to have 3 key players. Their emperor is obviously very important. His name was Emperor Hirohito. He was considered divine. At that point in history, Japan's emperors were considered basically God on earth, lower G. And so they were worshipped as such. They were not seen or heard. And they had this mythological existence that most people didn't know anything about. One thing that we did randomly know about Hirohito, completely had nothing to do with anything, was that he was an ichthyologist. He liked to study himself some fish. His prime minister, which was more the face of the government to the everyday people, was Hideki Tojo. And the head of the Japanese Navy is Admiral Yamamoto. Admiral Yamamoto, when he becomes aware of the planned attack on the U.S., he does feel bad because he was actually educated at Harvard and had quite a few friends in the U.S. However, it's kind of similar to General Lee with the Civil War, how he was asked to be in charge of the North, but he viewed himself as a Virginian first and foremost, and so therefore he became the head of the South military. It's similar in this regard, where Yamamoto felt bad for the U.S., but considered himself a Japanese person first and foremost. So these are those 3 men. So what's their plan? Japan was mad. They're like, what are you doing? We can take over other countries in Asia. We're sorry that it disrupted your trade, but don't go disrupting our trade as a result. And so they decided they wanted to attack our Navy to try to get us to back down. It happened to be that a huge portion of our Navy was stationed at a Hawaiian port of Pearl Harbor. Keep in mind, at this point, Hawaii is not a state. It is just one of our little territories that we controlled. But we happen to have quite a few of our naval presence at this Pearl Harbor. Ultimately, Japan later would express that its goal had been to conquer pretty much anything in Asia and control the entire Pacific Ocean, including things like the Philippines and Guam, which were also U.S. territories. Their goal was to attack America, get us to back down, get us to retreat, ultimately leaving Asia to be ruled by Asians. That was their quote. So the Pearl Harbor attack, early Sunday morning, around 7:55 a.m., so it's early Sunday on December 7th, 1941, when most people were either sleeping or on their way to church. Japanese kamikaze pilots in their Banzais and Zeros, which were their planes, bombed our port, attacking this naval base as well as civilian targets. Over 3,000 Americans were killed and or wounded. It's hard to say whether more were killed here or 9/11 because both are approximate counts. However, it's right up there. They're probably very close in number. The majority of the U.S. capital ships were damaged. Our battleships that we had spent, tons and tons of money during the Depression to build, these were damaged, some of them to the point where they could not be usable. They had to be scrapped for metal. The majority of the Pacific United States Army Air Force was destroyed on the ground. We had some that we had kept towards the Atlantic side of the country, but we lost a lot of planes that day as well. Luckily, our aircraft carriers were not at anchor, so they were saved, but now we don't have battleships or planes, so all we have are carriers. We also lost, like I said, a lot of troops. The most famous incident of Pearl Harbor, now if you've seen the movie is greatly historically inaccurate, so don't rely on Pearl Harbor to understand this battle. But the most famous incident was the sinking of the USS Arizona. The USS Arizona was one of our battleships. You can see it there getting hit. There were almost 1,200 soldiers still on board when the ship was hit, and it was hit in such a way that the boat slowly capsized, like, spun around and then sank. And the water flooded in very, very slowly. But the way that it flooded in, it trapped the men on board so that they could not get out. Efforts were made, valiant efforts were made to try to save these troops, but it just couldn't be done. And so for the next couple of hours, there's going to be all these rescue efforts as the boat is sinking, where you could hear the men on board screaming for their lives and banging on the side of the ships, but they weren't able to escape, and so slowly they drowned to death. To this day, as you can see in this picture, the boat remains at the bottom of the harbor. If you visit Pearl Harbor, if you visit Hawaii, you can take little boats out to this bridge where you can stand and look down upon the USS Arizona. There are a lot of debates that go on as to whether or not the USS Arizona should be raised, because it is polluting the waters of the harbor as the oil seeps out and as the metal deteriorates. However, it's basically hallowed ground. It's the tomb for 1,177 men. So a lot of times people argue you shouldn't mess with that. Nonetheless, as is typical American response when we are attacked, where the Japanese thought this would cripple our will to fight and it would hinder our war efforts, it actually inspires us. Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition became the slogan. The very next day, FDR goes into Congress, asks them for a declaration of war, declaring Pearl Harbor a day which shall live in infamy, and Congress agreed. They put it up for the vote, and it passed almost unanimously. We went to war. We declared war on Germany and Japan. Japan first, just to prove the point. And we were now effectively in World War II. Keep in mind that December 8th, 1941 is the last time that Congress has officially declared war, so technically World War II is our last true constitutional war. We've used other means to get around a congressional declaration since then for Korea, Vietnam, War on Terror, those types of things. With the majority of our fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor, we were scared because a lot of our outlying colonies like Guam and the Philippines were cut off from any military assistance as or just economic assistance. And the Philippines were the ones that were the furthest away and closest to Japan. So FDR was scared that some of these more remote locations were in desperate trouble, and he was right, because the Japanese were totally going to go after them. So FDR is going to order our troops in the Philippines, the Americans in the Philippines, to get out, to leave. And the troops there were headed by a guy by the name of General Douglas MacArthur. He didn't really want to leave because he actually was very fond of the Filipino people. However, you have to listen to your president, and he knew that it was probably the right call. So he left, promising his beloved Filipinos that he said, "I shall return." Here's MacArthur. Pretty well known. Got to start in World War I. So he left. He did keep behind some troops in order to try to help the Philippines if the Japanese invaded, which the Japanese did. The Japanese wind up conquering the Philippines on April 9th, 1942. Anybody that they captured, Filipino or American troops, they marched many miles to kind of like concentration camps, mostly through foresty regions. Along the way, many died from various diseases as well as were shot. So many that this became known as a Bataan Death March. It reminds me of the Trail of Tears. So the Japanese marched our troops, and Filipino troops killed many of them and then kept many of them as prisoners of war. The Japanese said between this and their attack on us in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese felt that they were indeed superior.